As the vaccine rollout continues to an admittedly impressive 20 million people, many are daring to hope that this lockdown nightmare might at last be coming to an end. Like frightened, abused and traumatised children, the British public have been suitably conditioned to view Big Pharma, aided and abetted by the veiled threats of Big Brother, as their saviours. So complete is their conditioning that the noble character traits of self-determination, stubbornness, resilience and purpose, so evident in their achievement of securing Brexit against every institution of government and wider society, seem to have utterly vanished in the face of this government's endless propaganda. But of all the depressing displays of human vice that this lockdown hysteria has revealed, perhaps the worst is just how quickly and how easily seemingly moral human beings have abandoned their principles. But that's the thing about principles. They're hard to follow when the going gets tough. It's easy to abide by one's principles well, when it's easy. When it doesn't involve any effort or cost or sacrifice. Just like posting a black square on Instagram to signal that you don't want to be mean to black people or something. That's easy. I didn't do it myself because, it would mean that I'd have to open an Instagram account. And I couldn't really be bothered. So if that makes me a Nazi, then I suppose I'll have to shoulder that burden. Unless, of course, being labelled a Nazi does actually become too much like hard work and a howling mob turns up outside my door. In that case, I'll happily post a black square. But not until then. And that's another thing about principles, is that when they are established across society, all of society benefits, or at least it should do, if they are drawn up with care. And that means that all of us benefit in the round, even if on occasions they occasionally disadvantage us in the short term. So if people have to be vaccinated against their will, so long as others can go off to Lanzarote, so goes the rationale. But I can hear people protesting, choosing to get onto a crowded airliner without knowing for sure whether or not you are able to infect others with COVID is irresponsible. Perhaps it is. But is it any less irresponsible getting on a plane without knowing for sure whether you are infected with diphtheria, gastroenteritis, meningitis, or indeed any of the 24+ infectious airborne diseases listed on the NHS website? And yet nobody appears to be pushing for vaccination passports for them. Why not? Surely diphtheria and meningitis are serious illnesses. But COVID is the current disease du jour that no one is allowed to die from. Another shabby little trick that those bereft of principle employ is by suggesting that, as we have in the past accepted some conditions on our ability to travel to certain destinations, then we must now accept any and all conditions demanded of us without complaint. A recent letter to the Spectator was in this vein, with the writer recalling that to travel to South Africa in 1966, one was required to be vaccinated against yellow fever and smallpox. These arguments have a certain logic which is difficult to counter. But in this case, the traveller was responding to a specific requirement from a particular country, which was hardly unreasonable. What we are being softened up to accept now, however, is that we must surrender our bodily integrity, which is the most supreme kind of sovereignty, to what is unarguably an experimental and rapidly developed vaccine for the privilege of not only going anywhere internationally, since this is a global spasm of conspiracy, but also to even do anything domestically. The writer of the letter to the Spectator goes on to say that he does not recall any complaints about infringements on freedom, impingements on human rights, or gripes against government surveillance. Well, that's because in 1966 the requirement of a smallpox vaccination, which was first available as a natural vaccine all the way back in 1796, or a comparatively newfangled yellow fever vaccination, available since 1938, was none of those things. In the age of CCTV, biometric passports, facial recognition capability and the smartphone, it is, by contrast, all of those things. This kind of argument is pernicious, and as it relates to principle, or rather lack of it, it applies to many other areas too. Take freedom of speech, for instance. Most people generally believe in the principle of freedom of speech, but at the same time, due either to laziness or stupidity, can quite easily be persuaded away from the principle by invoking the paper spectre of hate speech. Once the principle has been punctured, it is only a matter of time before it is undermined in a myriad different ways. Today, those who wish to restrict our speech further often cite the offence of incitement to racial hatred as an example of why certain speech should be restricted. As a part of the 1965 Race Relations Act, this well-meaning piece of legislation, designed to prevent people from casually tossing about the N-word, was the first crack in the dam. When the Islamofascists attempt to stop people talking about Islamist terrorism or the grooming gangs, they will often cite the prohibition of the N-word as an example of why we don't have, and what's more, shouldn't have, free speech. Freedom of speech should be for everybody, and it should be unrestricted, for everybody, just as one's bodily integrity should be absolute. Again, for everybody. Just as no one, apart from the speaker, should be allowed to decide what others say, or hear, no one should be able to decide what goes into a person's body, other than the owner of that body. Democracy, so said Benjamin Franklin, is two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. But crucially, the second part of that statement is often not quoted. Liberty, he continued, is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote. This is obviously one of those profound statements that has been most often adopted by Americans to show their support for gun ownership and their defence of the Second Amendment, where its utility is obvious. But in countries like mine that do not have a Second Amendment, nor an armed populace, the law should act as the defender of liberty. It is the law, or should be, that is the well-armed lamb. It is the law that should be the defender of the lamb's bodily integrity against the unscrupulous and opportunistic wolves of forced vaccination. In recent weeks, one of the fiercest and most vocal opponents of this lockdown hysteria, the Venerable Peter Hitchens, announced that he had been separated from his principles by being coerced to take the COVID jab. This was devastating news to me. If someone is outspoken and supposedly fearless in the face of the government propaganda machine can be forced to bend to its will, what hope is there for the rest of us? Hitchens is a freelance journalist who I imagine has been writing his weekly column for the Mail on Sunday comfortably from home, and is therefore not nearly susceptible to the pressure that will routinely be applied to salaried employees in key industries, the healthcare sector, as well as the very self-employed subcontractors of Pimlico plumbers. He says that he made the decision to have the vaccination due to the fact that many of his close family members live abroad, and if he refused to take it, he may never be able to see them again. As a 69-year-old, one would have to have a heart of stone not to have sympathy with his position, and he does at least have the good grace to entitle his article, "I've had the COVID jab, and all it cost me was my freedom." But that is how they get you. I've lost count of the number of friends that I've had conversations with who have said that they'd love to get together, and like me believe most of this is horseshit, and that they're not concerned for themselves, but that they have to be careful because so-and-so relative is vulnerable. And there you have it. They believe that it's horseshit, but they'll go along with it, just in case. And so the outcome is the same. We can't get together. So presumably we can't get together because they would feel guilty if they infected their elderly or asthmatic or respiratory compromised relative. So the government wins. So the government has managed to keep us apart. The fact that so many of the people I talk to seem not to believe the hype but go along with it anyway just confirms that the government is succeeding in its aims, despite not actually intellectually convincing anybody of their argument. As far as the government is concerned, not only do principles not matter, but neither does truth. I'm convinced that a major part of the lockdown strategy is to prevent people from getting together, not primarily to break the chain of infection, although I'm sure that's true of the particularly feeble-minded, but to prevent people from talking. You don't say the same things on a Zoom call that you do face-to-face. It seems to be a consensus amongst the people who study such things that only 7% of our communication is verbal. Given that the emotional terrorists in SAGE have devoted so much time to deliberately creating fear and distress amongst the population, this will not have escaped their notice. Much reduced, meaningful communication is not an accident. So frustrated as I am by this, I've even considered sending a group text to all of my friends to the effect of, I am ignoring the lockdown, and I'm ignoring all of the precautions surrounding it. I do not wear a mask anywhere, nor practice any form of social distancing, and I do not plan on changing my behaviour. Consequently, you may believe me to be a person of high infectious risk. With that in mind, it may be that we will be unable to see each other until the COVID threat, such as it is, subsides. If it does not, as some seem to believe it will not, I suppose that we will not be seeing each other again. Goodbye, and good luck. And although this seems overly dramatic, it does seem to chime with the government's intention of keeping us apart by whatever means necessary. Either they will keep us apart by force, or manipulate us to keep us apart by our own actions. And COVID vaccine passports, remember, were a wild conspiracy theory until about 17 seconds ago. Those who attempt to rubbish so-called conspiracy theories often ask the question, why? Why was Kennedy killed by the CIA, the Mafia, the Cubans? Why did the royal family have Diana killed? Why would the Americans commit 9/11 on themselves? Often this is a perfectly reasonable question to get to the truth. Equally as often, however, it is a question asked in order to flush out the conspiracist's worldview. You mean you think Hillary drinks the blood of prepubescent virgins? It's an effective way of neutralising your opponent. And the why is the thing that I've always had the most difficulty with. Nobody really knows the motivation of others. It's been an established opinion for some time that Boris, to use the cuddly, media-friendly name that nobody who knows him personally uses, is a libertarian. Up until March of last year, that certainly seemed to be the case. Unless, of course, he had spent the previous 20 years cultivating such a persona, until such time as the mask could be discarded, revealing the callous Machiavellian psychopath lurking within. Boris is a libertarian, they say. Why would he want to remove your freedoms? Why indeed? And it's a question I don't have an answer to. But perhaps the question is not why, but who. Who benefits? Cui bono, to use the original Latin. As I say, discovering an actor's motivation is tricky and inconclusive. And what's more, it's unprovable. So cui bono is a far more profitable line of reasoning, if I can mix my metaphors. The aim of the lockdown may very well be to break the chain of infection. That may be the aim. It may also be to take our rights and freedoms, to rob us of our agency, to create an atmosphere of suspicion by encouraging us to snitch on our neighbours, to sterilise us with the vaccine, to instill fear in us by forcing us to wear masks so that we cannot smile at each other and stymie our communication, to shut down all forms of social interaction like pubs, bars and restaurants, to prevent us from talking and forming a resistance, to bring in a cashless society where our income stream can be switched off like a tap, to force us all into smart cities where we'll all live in pods under constant unblinking surveillance robbed of our cars and forced into public transport, where the authorities will know precisely where each and every one of us is at any second and can swoop in at a moment's notice, the very nanosecond any one of us so much as utters the tiniest complaint, in order to prevent us from infecting others with our dangerous ideas. That may also be the aim, the motivation. It might be, but it's unprovable. But what is provable is the effects. The shutting down of the economy has resulted, or will result, in the obliteration of hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of small businesses. Certainly, millions upon millions of jobs will go, never to return. It has been suggested that 75% of all hospitality businesses will never reopen. In 2018, Britain was already losing 18 pubs a week. In 2020, that figure was almost 50. So we can argue about the motivation of lockdown. What we can't argue about is the effect. The effect is the destruction of small businesses by making them unviable and rendering them worthless and their premises valueless. Premises that will be snapped up by the big firms that have been unfairly privileged by the lockdown rules. That's the effect. But the result is an unprecedented transfer of wealth from the middle classes to the business elites at the top of society. That's the result. That's who benefits. So it may not be the aim to impoverish us and turn us all into indentured serfs dependent upon the goodwill of the state. It is nevertheless the result. It cannot be proved, despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence, that we'll own nothing and will be happy. But it seems as if at least one aspect of that infamous tagline is not entirely unlikely. After so much of the damage having already been done, there has been increasing amount of opinion, backed up by considerable evidence, that lockdowns, far from being the selfless act of a benign, caring government, are instead illogical and recklessly damaging tools of brute force that should never have been countenanced in a free society. These opinions and studies are just a trickle at present, but they are filtering through even to the mainstream media, who have, strangely since the end of Donald Trump's presidency, begun to entertain the validity of hydroxychloroquine, vitamin D, herd immunity, and the efficacy of masks and the PCR test, subjects that were solidly labelled misinformation when the Orange Man was still sitting in the Oval Office. So to get back to principles, at what point should we abandon them? That's not an easy thing to answer or to judge. If COVID really was as deadly as Black Death, maybe I wouldn't be so wedded to the idea of principle. If it really was like the plague, I'd probably be just as anxious as anyone to save my own skin. But it isn't the plague or the Spanish flu, and neither is it probably even as serious as the Hong Kong flu of 1968 to 69, which reportedly killed as many as 80,000 people. And that probably really was a genuine 80,000, since there is little in the historical record of any controversy surrounding the inflation of figures or the politicisation of the issue, as there has been with this virus. And neither is there anything in the historical record of lockdowns, masks or other non-pharmaceutical interventions, or NPIs to use the current vernacular. So it seems as if it is worse than the Asian flu, worse than SARS, and worse than swine flu. But for this we have burnt our economies to the ground and destroyed our civil societies into the bargain. When was it that we began to scare so easy? When was it that we decided that our desire to be safe overcame our desire to be free? When was it that our fear for our own safety became so great that we became prepared to violate the bodily integrity of other people? When did we change from a society that defined the idea that to force something into somebody else's body against their will was rape, to somewhere that the concept that the government, egged on by a manufactured majority, could force such a violation on the minority. To use a slightly clumsy analogy, wherever you stood on the Brexit debate, there was no hardcore of Brexiteers felt that they could override the human rights of Remainers simply because Brexiteers happened to be in the majority. Brexit, whether you liked it or not, was democracy in action. But this, there's no other word for it. This is tyranny. One of the many irritations of modern day discourse is the vapid exhortation to stay safe that people increasingly sign off emails with. This was always irksome, but has become even more excruciating since the start of all this virus bollocks. So much so that I had my t-shirts, which are incidentally available via the link in description, emblazoned with the alternative message, stay free. When was it exactly that we ceased wanting to be free? I suppose it must have been some time after we, as a society, despite being responsible adults with moral agency, decided that it was all right after all to allow the government to treat us like naughty children and watch our every move. At some point we decided that that was acceptable, even though we couldn't do the same to them. We couldn't watch our watchers, which was understandable of course, what with them being the adults. This, I suppose, is the natural progression that comes from phrases like, the defence of the realm is the first responsibility of government. Although that noble sounding impulse is usually related to things like national defence, it's not a great stretch for it to morph into the idea that the saving of lives is the government's first responsibility. But once you accept that, the government can use that excuse for doing literally anything. And they have. They have deprived people of their familial and personal relationships, robbed them of their livelihoods and their freedom of movement. All of it is justified because they are supposedly saving lives, even if in reality they are doing no such thing. But by using this crude and not to say dishonest excuse, they have managed to separate probably at least 2/3 of the British population from their previously cherished ideals and principles. It hasn't been difficult. It was just a question of applying leverage at the correct points. The print media, after a decade of free online news, were almost dead on their feet. Many of them were barely breaking even. But along comes the government with 300 million quid of invented taxpayers' money, and the media transforms instantly from something that government needed to manage and be wary of for its survival, to its most fervent lapdog, regurgitating all of its propaganda, while also doing the government's bidding by smearing quite moderate and reasonable questioners with the tag COVIDiots and COVID deniers. Most people, it seems, have failed the test in standing up for their own principles. For some it's just lazy thinking, for others it's naivety. Still others of my compatriots, I'm sad to say, it's a failure of courage. In the land of Henry V, good Queen Bess, of Drake and Raleigh and Nelson, and of the countless nameless heroes of the Somme and Ypres, of El Alamein and the skies over Kent and the frigid waters of the Atlantic convoys, and also of the great granddaddy of them all, the peerless, fearless, incomparable Churchill. It gives me no pleasure to say this, but it cannot be denied. The real virus isn't COVID, it's cowardice, and it is spread across this land, devouring all that is good and wholesome and strong and valiant and principled. But we must carry the torch, in the hope and in the belief that the British people will rediscover their former greatness. We come from good stock, so it must be in there somewhere. It's up to us to reawaken it. There is no mileage in bemoaning our numbers, for as some scribbler once wrote, the fewer men, the greater share of honour. And in any case, I suppose the lack of numbers is all part of the psyop to make us yield before the battle, before Saturday the 20th of March, the day we must stand up for our principles, and in doing so, shame those who won't stand up for theirs.